My next guest is such an inspirational speaker, leadership coach, strategist, and facilitator. With a career spanning over 15 years, Lacey has connected with over 250,000 people in over 40 countries. Much of her work focuses on empowering youth through advocacy, and then she also does some consulting at the local, state, and national level. She's a recipient of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration Voice Award and the National Association of Professional Women VIP Woman of the Year Award. I got to tell you, Lacey Deshari came on my radar because we're friends and we have mutual friends. And I got to watch her over the last number of years, and I've heard some of her inspirational story and some of her content, but I thought that she was just the ideal person to bring to this podcast. Welcome, Lacey.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you for doing this. I'm excited to have you on here as well. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm feeling a lot of, inspiration, motivation, some joy, some determination, all good things.
Yeah, it's amazing. The time that people are listening to this, whenever they're listening to this, is a time where you and I and everybody else is trying to figure out this transition between pandemic, stay-at-home orders, and you get ready to go out and try to restart your careers and lives and figure some things out. And so I can appreciate that perspective of forward thinking and positivity. So let's start with this, Lacey. If you can just start by telling us and the listeners a little bit about what you're doing right now. What's your current role? Give us a little bit more details about that background.
Sure. So I, as always, I wear a few different hats, never just one thing, but my full-time role right now is as an assistant director and an executive leadership coach at the Leadership Development Institute at LSU. Go Tigers. Had to throw that one in there. It's just amazing last year. But so what I do there is my primary role is to be an executive and leadership coach. And we work primarily with social impact organizations. And so that means anybody whose bottom line is not based on revenue. And so that can be military, that can be law enforcement. Right now, we're really highly focused on K-12 education and not just administrators. So when we say leadership, that can be anybody. I love Brene Brown's definition of leadership the most, is anybody who's charged with developing the potential in other people. And so that really shows up anywhere. It's not positional leadership based on your job title. It's really, if you are charged with supporting the development of other people, you are a leader. And so right now, my main role is to do leadership coaching and develop products and trainings and things that help people to develop their leadership skills.
That's great. So that's one of the things that I'm curious about. A couple of things. One of them, of course, is this podcast. It's about just learning people's stories, and I love to hear that. But this other piece that I've always been fascinated about for personal and professional reasons, I'm always curious about this idea of bringing out and improving other people and different people's philosophies and perspectives on leadership. We see these different perspectives that are about being in a certain position or having money or having power or access to power. And your framework of it seems to be different. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of leadership theories that I operate from, transformational leadership, servant leadership, and authentic leadership. And so they all have some different nuances, but really in the servant leadership, that's really putting the followers first. What are the needs of the followers? So it's very not a top-down authoritarian, I'm the leader, you're going to do what I say. It's very much what are the needs of the followers? What are the needs of the people we're serving? And how do we come together to best support that need? And transformational leadership really focuses on the vision, the shared vision. How do we engage people in that collective shared vision to make sure everybody's on the same page again, tapping into that personal motivation for each person to kind of join in that larger vision, and really focuses on strengths and development. So it's not, here's where you're not doing well, you need to do better in that. And it's not performance review. It's really, how can we all work together to be really empowered to serve this larger vision? And so in authentic leadership, is very much, there's an old mentality around, your work self is your work self. You leave your personal stuff at home. You cover your identities that don't belong in the workplace. And authentic leadership really brings out, how do you become your most authentic self and be able to present that as a strength and as a way to contribute to the larger vision. And so there's been a huge movement, particularly with the millennial and Gen Z generations, to be able to come to work as your whole self and not have to, cover your identities or anything like that. So, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. So I think two things I'm pulling from that, and I agree with all of what you just said, but one of them for sure is this outward focus, that it's not focused on attaining power, figuring out political structures and finding your way up, attaining resources. It's really about the other. I feel like it sounds to me like that's a reward in itself. But this other piece of authenticity, that's a piece that I hear so many people talk about. Maybe when they hit their stride in their respective career, it was when they were themselves. Mm-hmm. And so I find that to be something that I struggle with for sure, trying to figure out when can I be the silly Josh versus when do I need to be the serious Josh? When I'm angry or passionate, when can I show those places, whether it's in the workplace or working with relationships or anything else. And so I think that those are great challenges that people have to practice the rest of their lives. It totally makes sense. So tell us how you got to this place. So you're working at LSU, and is that go like a GEAUX? Is that right? Yeah. All right. So you got the LSU thing going for you, and you're working there, and then you have this public stage where you do a lot of public speaking, and you're consulting with people from all over the country, all over the world. So can you talk to us about kind of your career path? What was your steps to get there?
Yeah, so my career path is so interesting, and originally I was studying Latin, to be honest, because it was the only class that I could get up for and make it to in college, and I'll talk a little bit about why that was, but. Yeah. Then I realized all I could do with Latin is teach other people how to teach Latin. And I was like, okay, maybe I want to do a little bit more than this. So actually I got started in making an impact, a social impact through my own story, as most of us do. In my childhood, I grew up in a very abusive and neglectful situation. My mom was, in and out of prison, heavily addicted to meth and some other things. And so that was, and my parents split at 6, and I had a lot of siblings, and I was the oldest. And so really my start in leadership came out of that environment, and, really trying to make sure that my siblings were taken care of, helping make decisions, in daily life around, really just survival. And so that's honestly where I got that start. And then through the journey of all of that adversity and trauma, we all ended up in the foster care system. And so I went in at 15, largely because I learned to use my voice and I spoke up about what was happening in our household. And obviously that's a huge burden for a 15-year-old, knowing that we would likely end up in foster care, we would get split up, or, hearing the stories about being in foster care. And some of those were, true, and some of them were, just an amazing experience. And so I ended up using my voice, and that's really the point where I learned that my voice can make a difference. And so I spoke up for my siblings. We did end up going into foster care. We did end up getting split up. Some of us had better experiences than others. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here just for time's sake. But we did end up, one of my sisters and myself ended up in one placement eventually that did become our forever home. And so I ended up getting adopted when I was 28 by those parents. Wow. Yeah. And so that sort of was a really long journey from 15 to 28 to find some sense of identity and belonging and all that. But through the process, I got involved with what would, for speakers out or for listeners who know what student council is, for school. So there was youth advisory board. So it's kind of like a student council, but for foster care. And so I got involved with that when I was 18, served as a local president, went to the state board, served there. And then my first job out of college was their first hires, taking a chance on us, lived experience people to be national consultants. So we traveled all other states and helped them set up their advisory boards, helped empower youth to use their voice for policy, taught adults how to engage youth, taught youth how to use their voice. And then I ended up doing a lot of federal work around, just a lot of youth engagement policies and federal legislation and how that, trickled down to the states and helping states to implement, to most effectively engage young people in that whole process. So that's sort of how I got my start. And then through my own mental health journey and recognizing that I had a lot of trauma, a lot of unmet mental health needs, and ultimately had made plans to end my life. That because I was just so isolated and didn't know what was going on with me. I didn't know what I had been through was called trauma. I didn't know what I was dealing with was called depression, and which is why I only made it to Latin classes, because I didn't realize that I was dealing with depression and treating my depression with relationships and with alcohol. And so I finally learned that there were names for the experiences that I was having. And that allowed me to come into the mental health field, where there was this whole other youth advocacy movement happening. And so, long story short, was the first executive director of Youth Move National, which is youth motivating others through voices of experience. Got involved with the youth movement that way. And then I've kind of popped back and forth and recognized that like the key piece that transcends all of the systems change that we need is leadership. And so that's kind of in a roundabout way how I ended up where I am now.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that. I'm just curious about this idea around, and I know for time you kind of didn't want to get into too much of the details of some of the difficult experiences, but the result I think is really important. And so I'm kind of curious, as a 22-year-old, I'm guessing, right, a new undergrad, you are out there setting up these nonprofits, training people, and starting to do policy work. And that's a lot. And I'm just kind of curious about, there had to be a reconciliation point between some of the early stuff until being a young professional who's really takes off in their career. And so talk to me a little bit about that transition of being a young person, trying to make sense of your past and then being asked to do some really big lifts.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that's where some of the resilience factors came in. And I was extremely blessed because I was, I seemed to have the right opportunities with the right support, both at the right time. And so coming out of college, I had an amazing supervisor, amazing director. Like they understood the impact of Youth Voice. They understood that I was coming in not as a fully polished professional. And they knew that coming in. And that's why they hired me, is because I had that experience. And they were willing to meet me where I was, both personally and professionally. And they were willing to recognize my strengths, help me to see my strengths, because a lot of us that go through that level of trauma just don't feel like we have a sense of self-worth, don't feel like we have anything to contribute. And so they recognized that and were able to help me see some of my strengths and utilize those strengths in a way that was very empowering. And so we talked a little earlier about power, and there's power over, and there's power within, and then there's empowering, right? So and they were very empowering. They were able to give me opportunities to feel that power within myself and to feel empowered to apply my experiences and see them as strengths. So not everybody has those kinds of opportunities just, kind of given to them. And so I feel like I've had a lot of privilege with, being in the right place at the right time and having that support and those supportive relationships. So anybody listening out there, if you want to know how to help, that's one thing absolutely where you can start is in that mentoring role, or in that just being willing to have an open mind and meet young people where they are, and to be willing to see their past or their adversity as a strength and help them to see that strength.
Yeah. So I this idea of meeting people where they're at, it's great that you had good people around you who were able to see that you had this potential, but you didn't have the experience, and so they were able to kind of go to you and bring you along. I always think of it, when I was in grad school, we had talked there's a book called The Principles of Good Practice in Education, which was, again, I was in grad school at this point decades ago, or close to decades ago. But this book talked about meeting people where they're at. And I always had this visualization, or at least our instructors kind of described it as, imagine that there's a person on the side of the bridge and you're on the side of the bridge. That's the place where you want them to get. And in order to get them to come over to your side, you can't just yell at them and say, get over here. You can't just scream at them. You can't just beckon them. You can't even, offer them treats or money or whatever else. You actually have to go and cross the bridge to where they are at, get to know them a little bit, learn about where they're at, empathize with them, and then walk with them across towards the other direction. And so that to me has been, I've lost my way with that, to be honest with you, in personal and professional matters. But I think that when I am operating at my best is when I am meeting people where they're at. And so I love that. My guess is you've been able to apply that same concept in the work that you've done.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you just named two of what I think are the most important leadership skills to have is perspective taking and empathy, and then vision, honestly, and motivating others. So you just named a whole bunch of leadership skills in what you just talked about. And so that empathy piece is huge, huge, huge. And so whether we're willing to, and I'm trained in the Dare to Lead work from Brene Brown. And so I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the daring leadership versus the armored leadership and the empathy work that needs to show up in our work. But really being able to understand, being willing to take on other people's perspectives, being willing to assume that people are doing the best they can with what they have in the moment. That's generosity. And then asking, what do you see? What is your perspective? What is your story on this? And giving them a real space and building that trust for them to share authentically. I think those are huge pieces that I think companies are starting to recognize, that when people feel safe, and there's some research out there too that psychological safety is one of the number one indicators of productivity in teams. And so when you can build that trust through empathy, through perspective taking, through holding a space for them to share their real selves, then that's where you really meet people where they are.
That's great. I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about authenticity, because that's something that I mentioned earlier that I have varying kind of struggles with this. One of them is, yes, I operate at my best when I'm being authentic. If someone says, hey, do you want to go get something to eat? And I really don't want to go eat with that person, it's better for me to say no and not to go versus show up and be resentful at myself and at them. And I think we've all been in some version of that story. But on the other hand, I know that we are multidimensional. And, the way that we act in front of our kids at varying ages is probably going to be different than when we're hanging out with friends, talking a little bit of smack when we're having dinner versus, doing a professional presentation. All of those are us. And so I'm kind of curious about your perspective on how can we help people reconcile their varying dimensions and still feeling like they're being authentic?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really complex thing, but a lot of it just boils down to, I think, honesty with yourself first and foremost. And so I know that's something that I've really struggled with over the years. And I'm actually on a journey now to really deep dive and uncover a lot more of that, because I've never really given myself the space and time to just get to know myself and really who I am. I can sit here and say the values that I have or what I like, or, those things, but who I really am and what I really want. And so I think, the first step of authenticity is really just being able to become whole within yourself. And I don't think many of us, particularly I know those of us who grow up in our survival mode, we don't have the luxury of, getting to spend that time with ourselves. But we can have opportunities to do that if we seek those out. And ultimately, I love this saying, I don't know where it comes from, but, we are not at fault for our pasts, but we are responsible for our healing now where we are. And so when we can take some time and intentionally get to know ourselves within that, and then we're able to be honest with others. So your example of not wanting to go eat if you don't feel like it, that's something I've struggled with, for sure. And that's a great example of you're able to recognize, one, that you don't want to go eat right then for whatever reason, and then that's okay. And that you value yourself enough to be honest with other people, and people who value honesty, I think will have respect for that. The other thing I want to say about authenticity is that, being unapologetic and what that looks like. And so in leadership, we talk about overuse and underuse, like unskilled versus skilled versus overusing skills, right? So we can absolutely do any of these things too much or too little. And and when we come out and like, this is who I am and everybody else just has to deal with it. If it hurts other people, that's using it too much, right? So that's the overused side. The unused side is the dishonesty with yourself and then, not sharing that with others or being afraid to share who you are with others because of what they might think. But really when it comes down to authenticity and my experience, my story is out there. It is on the internet. It is, you can Google me and have speeches and YouTubes about all of the worst things, right? But I consciously made that decision early in my advocacy career, around the time I decided to not be a Latin professor, that my story, if it could serve a purpose for this world, then I wanted it out there and people can take it as they want. And I know for a fact that I have not gotten certain jobs because I've done that, because there's still a lot of stigma around adversity, around mental health, around recovery, around trauma, just frankly. And so I know that, and I knew that going in, that because I was being authentic at that level, and I don't recommend that for everyone, honestly. You've got to really think strategically around what you're sharing, who you're sharing it with, what impact that might have down the road. People like lawyers, doctors, if they know that you have a mental health condition, you can actually be prevented from getting your professional certification. And so things like that, you've really got to consider. But for myself, I have just come to terms with early on, and I'm really thankful that I did that. If somebody doesn't hold the same values that I do around mental health and around healing and around recovery, then it's probably not going to be a good fit for me working in that place anyway. And so, yes, there's stigma. Yes, there's strategic sharing. Yes, there's the way in which you talk about yourself. And that's really important when it comes to authenticity. But I think just owning, knowing first yourself and then owning yourself and your story, I think is what really can allow you to live free. And that's really what I think authenticity is.
That's wonderful. I also appreciate you bringing up the caveat of knowing your respective professions. Maybe there's a certain position you're in where you may have to consider to what level can you be as outwardly facing with who you are and where does that need to be placed. It's almost like, in my team at work, we talk about reading the room and figuring out, is this the place for me to go ahead and be, funny, Lucy, silly Josh, or in this presentation, or is this the room where I need to be a little bit more serious and direct and just deliver the information, and figuring that out, where's the safe places to do that. So even on a day-to-day basis in my work environment, I do consider which part of me is going to show up. But ultimately, I love the risk that you took. And here's why. I connect with it so much because if you can be you long term, that other stuff is going to come out. Your story, your truth is going to come out because that's who you are. Unapologetic, that's who you are. So let's say you land the gig and then the stuff comes out because of conversations. How does that help or hurt you? And that's, I think, when you're consistent from the start, you can keep that up forever. And so I love the idea that you said, early on, I'm going to make some decisions to really be honest about myself out there. And I will be able to align with people who can support that and keep up with that. And those that I are not aligned with it, they're not for me and I'm not for them. And that's just a wonderful place. One other point too, and I want to get to our big question here. I also think about this dissertation process. I'm writing a dissertation right now for my doc program. And the early group, when I had that first round of advisors, one of the people warned me about some of the information that I was sharing in there and disclosing in there. And I think her concern was, you got to think about your future profession. If people read this dissertation, and they will they want to hire you? And I think your point that you made is exactly why I said, well, I want to work for people who want to hire that guy, right? I don't want to work for some other version, people who want to hire some other version of me, because they're not hiring me, they're hiring another person. So I just love that.
That's awesome. I love that too. Yeah, that's fantastic. And what I want to touch on one thing that you said really quickly, because there's a lot of people who might be, okay, so like if I act this way to this audience, am I being authentic or not? And I just want to point out that, like, when you mentioned silly Josh or serious Josh or whatever, like, those are all Josh, right? Those are all authentically Josh. It's just how you show up. Now, if you felt like you had to be a completely different person in that room, that's where you become inauthentic, right? Or you start trying to talk about things that you don't have experience in, or expertise that you haven't actually gained, or whatever. Those are places where you move into the inauthentic place. And so it's absolutely smart and savvy to know your audience and to know what they need, right? Going back to that servant leadership, like, how can I best be of service to this group of people? And that might not be showing all of myself, but you can still be authentic to the parts that are going to be as best to them, and staying in line with your values and integrity with your values. You don't have to share the details of how you came to those values. If you stay in integrity with your values and you act out of those values, you are being authentic.
I want to work for you one day.
Let's work together.
All right. So I think we're at that point where it's time for the big question of the best worst thing. And for those who are, maybe if this is your first time listening to us or your third, it's just as a reminder. The best worst thing is about a time that was personally or professionally challenging, a time where maybe our guest has experienced a setback, challenge, loss. And so we want to know about the experience and how they got through it and some of the lessons learned. So Lacey, what was your best worst thing?
Such a great question. I love that that's what this is called. So yeah, to narrow it down, I would say just knowing myself and having gone through all of the adversity and trauma I've gone through, and recognizing that, like, I need to be in 12-step programs. So I participate in those as a way of healing for me. And that is honestly the best worst thing. It was the worst thing to know that, like, okay, I have issues with this substance and with these relationships, and that I have to be in a 12-step program to deal with, this dependence on a substance or on, an emotional dependence of relationship. And so for me, like, that was, I was sharing earlier that, like, I spent about 18 months just resentful and disappointed and depressed. And, that, like, I have these diagnoses and I have to be in these rooms. But today, like, I can say with utmost confidence that, like, I'm so grateful that I am an alcoholic, that I do have emotional dependence issues, because it led me to these programs. Because what these programs have done for me is to give me the tools that I did not get growing up, to deal with life on life's terms, and to recognize what emotions I'm feeling and recognize what behaviors I have based on those emotions, and the ability to pause. Pause when I'm agitated, pause when I'm, not have to react to somebody immediately based on emotions. I can pause and kind of take that in and understand, okay, where might they be coming from? That perspective taking we talked about. Are they operating out of the best that they can do right now? Can I be considerate of that? And then what's my part in this? Did I contribute to their response to me? And how do I own that and make that right and keep my side of the street clean? And those are the things that, my gosh, I am so grateful today that I have gotten involved, like that my life, my whole life, really is the best worst thing that has led me to these programs, into this place and healing. And now I'm on a journey where, I talked about that authentic self and giving myself the gift of being with myself and learning myself at a deeper level through a 12-step program related to relationships and emotional dependence. And like, that's just the best worst thing now is that I have this, through these horrible experiences, I have this joy that I've gone through them, and I can see the benefit that they've given into my life, and I can see how they're contributing to all areas of my life now, whether it's business and being able to make sound decisions and deal with conflict and in a way that's productive, and or personal relationships that have been very trying, and parenting. Growing up, I did not have a good role model of what a mom was, and now through all of my experiences, I've gotten to see, like, I can be what I wish I would have had. And so I think that might be a really big answer to the best worst thing, but I'm just so grateful now to have had the adversity that I've had. And I was not grateful when I went through it. And I was not grateful until I took the time to realize how that contributed to my growth and my health and my, my potential. And so, yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you for sharing that. One of the on some of the introductions that I have, I talk about how there are some experiences that we just would rather not go through. Like, okay, I got enough of that one.
Yep.
That's enough trauma in that area. I'm covered all traumatized out in that area. Let's move on to something else.
Yep.
So, I know we're not advocating for, trauma in anybody's lives, but I got to tell you, that's been my experience with traumatic experiences as well. They stink when you're going through them. They're the worst things. There's just no best to it. And it's not only until you get to the other side that you really start to make sense of them and you get fortified. And then it puts you in a position to actually help people through that journey as well, which is incredibly amazing. I want to talk about just 12-step programs in general, just generally talk about them. It's one of those things where I feel like 12-step programs should be something that everybody should go through. It's like, I know it wouldn't be anonymous. It'd be totally anonymous because everybody's doing it. So, it wouldn't matter. But the idea that, the deep scour that you have to do in 12-step programs where you have to really address, be honest with, talk about some things that maybe you don't even like to think about, and the ability to actually work through some of that. And then you talk about the skills-based things about, being able to try to identify where that person's coming from and seeing where they're at, being able to focus on things you can control and letting go of those other things that you can't. And there's so many things that go along with that program that with every 12-step program, with a lot of 12-step programs that are leadership, that are life lessons. There's a tool book that you can supplement with, like, your faith or your religion or your just spirituality or even just your values to really push your life forward. I would encourage people, whether you are dealing with sobriety or whether you're just somebody who's interested in, in learning how to empower yourself, that's one of the many tools that you should consider exploring if you're not where you're at, where you want to be. I mean, it's everybody I know who's been through and who continues to practice. I think I'm like, oh gosh, everybody needs this thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, that shows up a lot in my leadership coaching. And I use a lot of the tools that I got from 12-step actually. And people are like, that's so insightful. How'd you come up with that? And I'm like, well, it's just a great practice. And
it's been around for over 100 years or whatever, but that's all right.
Yeah. I've seen it work with a lot of people. So, give it a try.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I just, Lacey, listen, when I look at you, I just see a powerful person who's integrated so many parts of your life, past, present, and future. And it's come together to be this amazing, beautiful, creative existence. And I'm just deeply impressed by you. And I do hope that people who are listening get a chance to look you up and learn more about you and maybe even bring you in so that you can do some work with their respective organizations, institutions. I would say higher education and outside corporate. I think that you're a person who, your voice and your experience and your insights, oh my goodness. So just a couple of things. One of them is, one piece of advice would you give to people who are going through a hard time to get to the other side, especially to align both their personal and professional needs? What's the piece of advice that you would give them?
I'd say the number one piece of advice is to reach out. Don't think that you have to do this alone. If you are going through something, no matter how horrible or horrible that you feel like you've done, I guarantee you there are other people out there who have done the same thing or experienced the same thing, who have come through it on the other side. And don't give up in the dark parts, because that's the middle of the night. The sunlight will come. And, reach out. Don't be, even if you're afraid to ask for help, do it anyway. Just say, hey, I'm struggling, and whoever that is, and get in touch with other people who can share their experience, strength, and hope with you around that issue. There's so many resources available today. And especially like during COVID, I know that's been a really challenging time, but it's a great opportunity as well to kind of reflect and, sit for a bit and reach out for that help and that, that inspiration. Because I promise that no matter what you're going through, there are other people who are able and willing to help you through that.
That's perfect. So, Lacey, how can people find you? Do you have social media? What's the best way for people to find you or get a hold of you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy that you asked me to be on here, and I'm happy to be of service. My website is laceyDesherry.com. That's the best place to get me. It links to all of my other, hats that I wear, my consulting and leadership coaching and all that. So that's the best way to get a hold of me, laceyDesherry.com. And I am on Instagram. I'm not a big, influencer or anything like that. You're going to see a lot of pictures of my daughter and my new dog. But yeah, you can message me on there or on Facebook. But my email and contact information is on the website.
That's perfect. Well, Lacey, again, so inspirational. Thank you so much for joining us on the Best Worst Thing podcast. And I look forward to connecting you offline here.
Thanks, Josh. Appreciate you letting me come on.
Thank you for listening to the Best Worst Thing podcast. I'm your host, Josh Walewa. Music is produced by DJ Josh One. You can follow him at Boom Note on Instagram and Twitter, and Josh One on Spotify. The Best Worst Thing podcast is edited by Cool Jets Audio and Visual. You can find them at Cool Jets AV on Instagram. Our marketing is designed by Francesca Daniels. You can find her at FrankandKitty24 on Instagram. And our overall design is by Inspired Design with Ryan Daniels. You can find them at getinspired.design on Instagram. Please download us from iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite platform. And remember to share us with your friends, especially those people you think really need us in their life. Don't forget to give us a 5-star review. Thank you for listening to The Best Worst Thing.
The cool Cali kid from the boondocks. Bounce through your hood like chocolate with a crime on. Independent thing to play a beat, I get my rhyme on. So when I strut on a path to perfection, city to your borough, to your town, to your streets. Keep your party live, Josh One got beats out of nature. Grazer, Oakland, strays to Asia. It's like Fraser, force of Fantasia. Move through your suburbs.